The title of this presentation is Introduction to Resilience. Resilience as an evolving concept. Why adaptation and building resilience are important for the development? It's simply because many development activities are sensitive to climate, either in terms of current climatic variability or in terms of future climate change. I have here some examples. For instance, the agriculture is very dependent on rainfall patterns, droughts, land fires, issues that we have been looking now in recent years can destroy large areas of forests and farmlands. Ecosystem services such as supply of clean water to human development and agriculture are at risk in many countries that are dependent on rainfall. Infrastructures in many cities and urban areas are sensitive to flooding. These all are examples of why adaptation and resilience are important for our human development in the future. In this presentation, I'm going to shortly define the concept of mitigation to climate change and adaptation. And then I'm talking about resilience, what's the concept, and give some examples of it. And then I go to the elements of IPCC climate risk, which is consisting of three components: hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And then at the end, I'll explain a little bit what is the difference between vulnerability and resilience, and what's the difference between resilience and adaptation. This is an example of forest and climate change and the concepts of mitigation and adaptation in this context. So the climate change and climatic variability have some impacts to our ecosystems and to our societies. And then, of course, as humans, we respond to those impacts in different ways. One way of responding to those impacts is trying to reduce the climate change and the climatic variability, and trying to stop climate change through reduction of emissions to the atmosphere and other actions. When the action or the response is really trying to influence the climatic variability or climate change itself, we call it mitigation. So we are mitigating climate change by reducing the emissions, for instance. If the action or response is related to the impacts of climate change, we are trying to make these impacts less, or trying to make our societies more resistant to those impacts. We call these actions adaptation. So we are adapting to impacts of climate change. In terms of forest and natural ecosystems, the mitigation actions are usually related to the carbon pools, emissions, and carbon sequestration that are coming or related to land use sector. So we are trying to increase our ecosystem carbon pools and reduce the emissions from ecosystems to the atmosphere. In the adaptation part, we are trying to increase the ecosystem resilience. That means ability to cope with the impacts of climate change and climatic variability. And that's why we are also reducing the vulnerability of our systems through adaptation. Resilience is the characteristic or the capacity of social, economic, and environmental system to cope with events like shocks or disturbances. So it is characteristics of the system. It is a characteristic that describes how the system is reorganizing or responding in different ways to maintain its functions, identity, and structure. It is also a very important way of thinking about how it can lead to increase the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. So if we are resilient in terms of our economic systems, for instance, learning about the economical shocks or world crises, economical crises, will build our societies more resilient towards the future. And in the climate change discussion, we usually see that the resilience is the opposite of vulnerability. Here I have some examples of the resilience and its concept. So here I have this situation which we call high resilient system. So I have this black ball in this kind of a valley between the two the mountains. So the movements of the ball in this this valley are rather stable. If the ball, for instance, falls from where the gray ball is now, it usually ends up at the end where the black one is. So it may move around, but still it is very stable. It comes to one stable solution, and that is very resilient system. It returns to its original status after disturbance. In the second example, we have another system which is much lower in terms of resilience. If we have a disturbance or shock, it can move this ball from the position of the gray ball to the position of the black ball, but it can also move to another state that might be stable, but it's different from the original. So that's why we call this system low resilient, because it doesn't necessarily return to its original state. It can be returning to another state, but not the original one. And then a third example, which is related to adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is a concept which is very much used in the climate change adaptation discussion. So here we have a situation where this gray ball can end up in the position of the black ball, either on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side. It means that whatever happens to this the gray one, it always ends up in a stable situation, either on the left or in the right. So it has high adaptive capacity because it has two options to return to a stable state after a disturbance. In the ecosystem discussion, or when we are talking about restoration and recovery of ecosystems, we can also think about the concept of resilience through this example. Here on the right-hand side, I have an ecosystem in its degraded state, and then when it has been restored. So degradation is process bringing the ecosystem from the state below to state above, and the restoration is the process, or recovery is the process where the ecosystem goes from the state above to the state below. And here, actually, we are talking about the same. We have a stable, resilient ecosystem. And then when the degradation process starts, degradation is here marked on the X. When the degradation starts, it's the resilient system start moving to another stable status, or even further at the bottom of the scale, when it is really not resilient anymore, and it's degraded. So bringing back the system from the degraded into a resilient is practically moving the ball upwards through different actions that are described here as recovery. So this is an example that's very much used in the ecosystem studies related to ecosystem resilience. Another way of describing the resilience, which has been very much done by the ecologist, is to look at the time scale, or the time frame of the resilience. Here we have a system that is in the stable state, and then it will be influenced by a shock or disturbance, let's say a land fire or a drought or whatever, and then the system moves to another state. For instance, it loses its biomass through an attack of a disease, for instance, and then it starts its slow recovery and return towards the original stable state. So the recovery process, it can be short or long, depending on the characteristics of the system. If the system is very resilient, then the recovery period is short, and it comes back very soon and very fast, and it reaches the original stable state at the end. If the resilience is not so strong, it can be taking a long time to come back, and it can even end up in a different stable state, which is different from the original stable state. For instance, after a land fire, ecosystem can take about 100 years, let's say, to come back from the total burned area to original forest cover, depending on the conditions of the ecosystem. And this is what ecologists usually are using to describe the time frame related to the recovery of the ecosystems after a shock. And now I'm going through the main concept in adaptation according to the IPCC definitions. So the climate risk is an interaction of the socioeconomic development and climate variability and climate change. So practically we have two main elements in the system. We have the climate, that means natural climate variability and climate change. And the second, then we have the society, including all the development pathways that society is taking, including all the adaptation and mitigation actions the society is taking, and issues related to governance and how do we manage our environment and natural resources. And of course, there is a link between the society and the climate in terms of emissions, increasing emissions of fossil fuels or in emissions from the land use change. We are pushing the climatic change higher, and of course then changing what is the climate impact on the society, which is not only coming from the natural climatic variability, but the climate change that is driven by human emissions or human-induced emissions. And there are three elements that IPCC is defining as the elements of the climate risk. One is called hazards, which is the part what is related to climate. So we have, let's say, storms, droughts, the issues that are related to the climatic variability or climate change, we call them hazards. They are these shocks or disturbances that are coming from the climate itself. Then we have two elements that are coming from the society and socioeconomic processes related to human activity. One is called vulnerability, and the other one is called exposure. And all three elements are then forming what we call a climate risk, which is an interaction of the climatic part on the left and the human society on the right. And now in the next slides, I'm going through these three elements, hazards, vulnerability, and exposure, one by one to explain and what do they mean and how do we understand them. So let's start with hazards. So here is a graph which is looking at the Ethiopian agriculture productivity from the 1982 to 2010. And also we have some data on the GDP, agriculture GDP, and rainfall variability. Rainfall variability are these yellow bars. So sometimes we have had a lot of rain, sometimes we have had drought periods with very low rainfall per year. And this is now compared to the long-term average, which is here marked as 0. Then we have two graphs that are the blue one and the red one, which are describing then the economic activity of the Ethiopian society from 1982 to 2010. The red one is agriculture GDP, and the blue one is the whole GDP or national GDP of the country. And let's say particularly in the period from 1982 to 1998, you can see that both of the GDP curves, agriculture GDP and national GDP, are following very closely the rainfall patterns. That means in a good year with a lot of rainfall, the GDP is higher, and then in the drought years, the GDP is lower than average. The situation changes a little bit after 1998. We see that the red the graph, which is the agricultural GDP, still follows the rainfall patterns, but the national GDP is already behaving a little bit differently. Of course, this is illustrating that the country is less dependent in terms of economics. It is economy from the agricultural GDP. So there are service sector and other sectors that are contributing to the national GDP, and that's why the dependence or the relationship between the rainfall patterns and national GDP is not so close than it was in the previous years, but still in the agricultural sector we see that the agricultural GDP very much follows the rainfall pattern. So this is an example of the influence of precipitation and rainfall variability into the national GDP of Ethiopia. And of course, if we think about that, most of the countries in Africa and also many countries in Asia are countries where the agriculture is very high proportion of the national GDP. It illustrates that the dependence of these countries on the climatic the patterns, the climate variability, and now also in the future climate change, then of course is putting several considerations of the future development pathways of these countries. How vulnerable these countries are if the rainfall patterns are changing with the climate change, if the national GDP is so much dependent on agriculture. And of course, the similar situation is when we see the whole, let's say, the general human development, here illustrated with the Human Development Index. We have many countries, the same countries than the previous slide, which have a lower Human Development Index compared to the other countries. And of course, there are several models and scenarios related to the how African countries, the precipitation patterns will change and how these will influence the future agriculture in those in that continent. Here is another one. One example of the precipitation changes in the Southern Africa by 2080. So we see in the western part, particularly much drier environment than we are experiencing now. Or another one which is related to agricultural systems in arid and semi-arid areas. How then the length of the growing season is influenced by precipitation. We have two scenarios, one on the left and one on the right. But we see in both cases that the belt, the sub-Saharan belt, and also some areas in the southern part of Africa, we will have a shortening of the growing seasons because of the changes in the precipitation patterns. So these are the kinds of the hazards or climate-related impacts that the African societies will experience with the climate change. Now, when we look at the exposure is an interesting concept because it is influencing practically across all the continents, across all the countries, and across all the societies, because it's related to the location of our assets and production areas and how climatic variability and climate change may influence on that. Here are examples of things that we see in the TV practically every week. Some areas of the world are experiencing a huge flooding in urban areas, which means that our urban societies are not resilient enough in order to be able to cope with this kind of situations where we have high precipitation areas in a built-up environment where all the natural spaces have disappeared and they have been replaced by the urban areas, and the concentration of people in smaller areas is of course making this a little bit more difficult. Here are just an example of the World Development Report a couple of years ago. What is the number of people exposed to floods by 2010? On the left-hand side, we have the numbers in absolute numbers, and on the right-hand side, we have in terms of relative terms as a percentage of the people exposed per year, and we are talking about in total about 70 million people per year in globally is exposed to floods. That was about 10 years ago. This data is from 2010. I'm not going into details, but I'm saying that this kind of exposure to flooding now with the increased urbanization and concentration of people into certain areas is of course getting worse with the time. And of course another exposure very much that has been discussed in the recent years is what happens with the sea level rise, because it will change the livelihoods of millions of people that are living close to the seashores, and we know that the most of the human population is living around 100 kilometers or less from the coastline. So we are talking about huge number of people that are exposed to impacts of sea level rise. And here are some examples from the IPCC report from 2012 about the exposure of people to tropical cyclones. We see the numbers in Asia that we are talking about 73 million people were exposed to cyclones in 1970, and we estimate that in 2030 this same number will be about 126 million people, simply because of the huge population increase in Asia. So the exposure is basically a characteristic of our society, and it's related to location of our assets and people. If we are living in areas close to shorelines, close to waterways, and areas that are influenced by the climatic variability and climate change, then we have high exposure. This is a global map from the World Risk Report of 2017 of the exposure to natural hazards. This includes earthquakes, storms, floods, droughts, and sea level rise. And those that are marked in red are the highest levels of exposure, and then those who are marked here in this map with green are the lowest level of exposure. And then the other part of this human related impact of related variables related to climatic risk is this vulnerability. Vulnerability is practically the propensity or predisposition of a system to be adversely affected. This is a rather complicated definition by IPCC, but it means that a system is vulnerable if it's unable to cope with these adverse impacts, including climatic variability and extremes like the flooding. So if we have a vulnerable system, a city, for instance, which is unable to cope with flooding, then we have hundreds of thousands of people in those cities living in the conditions where the water is entering the homes, and then the traffic is practically stopped in many areas of those urban concentrations. So vulnerability is a kind of is related to very much on what we call adaptive capacity. It is a characteristic of the society, how well societies can adapt or somehow prepare itself for these hazards and adverse climatic effects. And so it's basically vulnerability is the opposite of resilience, because the resilience is the capacity of systems to cope with trends and shocks and different disturbances, and the vulnerability of lack of that. So it is basically a very nice kind of a pair. Resilience is not vulnerable, and vulnerability is not resilience. And lack of adaptive capacity in the same World Risk Report in the map, which is very much those countries that I showed earlier with the high proportion of the GDP related to agriculture sector, mainly in Africa and in Asia. Vulnerability is also an interesting concept because it takes the population dynamics into consideration here. For instance, we can think about combining the demography, that means people and the age structure of the people, and then the vulnerability, the location, and the exposure into one concept of human climate vulnerability map. And it's very much, as I already mentioned, related to, for instance, availability of water to different societies. Same countries that have scarcity are experiencing scarcity of water, either because of economic reasons or by natural reasons, are most likely to be those countries that are also vulnerable. And an example of the vulnerability also is showing the increasing population globally and the exposure of these people into vulnerable areas that are high risk areas. You can see here in this graph, which is the number of weather-related catastrophes from 1980 to 2012. You see a stable increase of those. These are the insured, are the ones that are in blue, and overall losses are in green. The reason why I have put this 100 billion here on the left-hand side is that 100 billion is what the Green Climate Fund is going to allocate to climate change adaptation and mitigation, and it shows the investment in relation to weather-related catastrophes. So we are talking about the same order of magnitude of impacts of weather-related catastrophes than the annual invest from the humanity to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the categories of vulnerability can be also divided into different kind of categories. It can be internal, related to society itself. It can be external, related to more to external factors. It can be socioeconomic, or it can be biophysical. And of course, because the vulnerability, as I mentioned already earlier, is the opposite of the resilience, it can also apply to resilience. So we have here internally, we are talking about income, access to information, networks, topography, related to the land cover, economic conditions. Here on the external ones, we are talking about economic globalization, investments, storms, sea level rise, and so on and so on. So these are the examples of the vulnerability categories. And vulnerability can be mapped in this way. It is very similar to what I already showed of the lack of adaptive capacity, of course, because the lack of adaptive capacity is automatically leading to vulnerability. And then these are the same countries that are in Africa and Asia that I already mentioned earlier. And then combining these two elements, the vulnerability exposure, that means society-driven climatic risks. In this World Risk Report, they are talking about here as a result of exposure and vulnerability. It's a kind of a combination, which is bringing together the socioeconomically driven parameters of the climate risk. And we see the countries here on the red, with red color, they are with the higher risks, and then the countries with green color are with lower risks. And just to finalize my presentation, this is the last slide. I just want to bring together these issues, because now we are very much talking about climate change adaptation. And on the other hand, for instance, here in this, the presentation, I have been focusing on resilience. And of course, there might be a confusion. Then what is the term that we should use? I would say that we should use both of them if we use them wisely. Resilience is a capacity or characteristic of a system, being it a human system or natural system. Adaptation is an action of us to adjust the system, be it the natural system or human system. So here we are talking about more a kind of a system that is coping, or it is kind of a resisting the changes and recovering from the shocks and disasters. And here the adaptation is more kind of an intentional, planned action to go into the same direction. So of course we can say in the very short that in adaptation we are intentionally trying to adjust our systems, be it natural or human systems, to be more resilient and less vulnerable. So that's why, because we are trying to bring vulnerability down, we are increasing the resilience. So it is adaptation is also kind of a action where we can either trying to avoid the negative impacts, but we can also try to exploit the positive impacts of climate variability and climate change. So these are the two pairs: resilience as a characteristic of the system and adaptation as a process of adjusting the system, are the same or different parts of the same thing, different look from different angles. Thank you so much.